And now we are live on Facebook. Good evening and welcome to today's session, everyone. Today we are honored to have Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee with us to deliver the 11th Karwan Distinguished Lecture titled The Sacking of a Teacher, an Annal of Early Calcutta. A renowned historian and author, Rudrangshu Mukherjee has taught history at the University of Calcutta and held visiting appointments at Princeton University, the University of Manchester, and the University of California, Santa Cruz. He was the founding vice chancellor of Ashoka University when the university began in 2014 and was succeeded in 2017 by Pratap Bhanu Mehta, a great columnist. He was the editor of the editorial pages at the Telegraph, Calcutta. He studied at Calcutta Boys School's Presidency College, Calcutta, and JNU, New Delhi, and St. Edmund Hall, Oxford. He was awarded a D.Phil in modern history by the University of Oxford in 1981. Professor Mukherjee is internationally acclaimed as a historian of the Revolt of 1857 in India. His first book, Awadh in Revolt 1857 to 58, study of popular resistance, published in 1984, has become a standard reference on the subject. He has looked at the 1857 rebellion in four other books: Spectre of Violence, the 1857 Kanpur Massacre, 1998, Mangal Pandey, Brave Martyr or Accidental Hero, published in 2005, Dateline 1857, Revolt Against the Raj, published in 2008, and The Year of Blood, Essays on 1857, published in 2014. He has authored other books and other themes, including the Penguin Gandhi Reader in 1993, Politics and Trade in the Indian Ocean World, Essays in Honor of Ashin Das Gupta, published in 1999, Remembered Childhood, Essays in Honor of Andre Betil, published in 2010, New Delhi, The Making of a Capital, published in 2009, Great Speeches of Modern India in 2011, Nehru and Bose Parallel Lives in 2014, Twilight Falls on Liberalism in 2018, and Oxford India Short Introduction, Jawaharlal Nehru in 2018. Sir, we are truly honored to have you this evening with us to deliver the 11th Karwan Distinguished Lecture. So without further ado, I would request Professor Mukherjee to begin with his presentation. And if we have any questions from the audience, we'll be taking that towards the end of this lecture. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitations once again. Welcome to the session.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to speak on this platform. I'm going to concentrate on one episode which seemingly appears to be unimportant, but I hope I'll be able to show through this presentation in the next 35 minutes that it was not as insignificant as it often appears to be. The sacking of a teacher. The teacher concerned was a person called Henry Louis Vivian Desrosiers, who was sacked from the Hindu College in 1831, late April 25th, 1831. He actually resigned, but the circumstances were such that the words he resigned are somewhat of an euphemism. He was forced to resign. So therefore, I'm sticking to the word sacking. But before I actually describe what happened and what led to Desrosiers' departure from Hindu College, I need to set the context. Otherwise, this episode will not be that clear or that comprehensible. And to do that, I need to go back 15 years from 1831, when this episode happened, as I said. In 1816, a person who was later to become very famous and is a familiar name to anybody who studies modern India at whatever level, school to postgraduate, Ram Mohan Roy, called a meeting of like-minded people, his friends in his house. The purpose of that meeting was to discuss how idolatry, the worship of idols, could be eradicated in India. In that meeting, even though he was uninvited, he hadn't actually been asked to be present at the meeting, but because he was a very close friend of Ram Mohan Roy, was present a person called David Hare, who was Scottish in origin. He had come to Calcutta in the late 18th century, 1798, and he had set himself up as a watchmaker. Then he had sold his watchmaking business after making quite a bit of money. And he was a familiar figure in Calcutta, both in Calcutta English British circles as well as among the elites of Bengalis who lived in Calcutta. David Hare in this meeting made a suggestion. He said, look, I understand the importance of what you are discussing. I'm not trying to underestimate it, but my suggestion would be that unless people of India, and especially Bengal, become educated, idolatry cannot actually be eradicated. So we are not really addressing the problem. The main issue is that we should all get together and set up an educational institution which would impart education to the young people of Calcutta, and a particular type of education. I'll come to that in a minute. And through that education, there would be enlightenment, and that would lead to the criticism and finally the eradication of idolatry. Everybody in that gathering agreed that Hare indeed was making a very, very relevant and an important point. But nobody actually took the idea forward. There was an agreement, but there was no action. So Hare took his suggestion elsewhere. He took his suggestion to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Calcutta, Sir Edward Hyde East. And he told Edward Hyde East, there seems to be some enthusiasm among the Bengalis for this kind of a Western educational institution. Why don't you do something about it, given the fact that by the 1813 Charter Act, the English East India Company had been instructed by the House of Commons to set aside 100,000 rupees per annum for the development of the education of Indians. So he suggested that this money could be used. There was support coming from, enthusiasm at least coming from Bengalis, and there could be a government and a citizens joint venture in setting up an educational institution. Edward Hyde East was supportive of the idea, but he did some, what today we would call due diligence of his own. And he discovered that indeed there was support for such a proposal. Not only was there support for such a proposal, there were people who were actually willing to put money behind this proposal, not just talk about it and give their support, but they were willing to put their money where their mouth was. So through this joint venture, as it were, with Edward Hyde East as the chairman of the governing body and the Governor General as the patron, was established the first Western educational institution in India. It happened to be in Calcutta. It was called the Hindu College, set up on the 20th of January, 1817. So 1 year from the date of the meeting in Ram Mohan Roy's house. Oh, an interesting sidelight which says more about Ram Mohan Roy, but it also says something about those who were putting their money into the, the college, the Bengalis who were putting, or citizens of Calcutta, the great and the good of Calcutta, not all of them were Bengalis who were putting their money behind this enterprise. In a meeting at Edward Heidi's house, a group of people said, group who were actually going to put their money, some of them said that if Ram Mohan Roy, who is known to have very unorthodox views on the Hindu religion, particularly on caste, particularly on idolatry, if he is part of this project, we are not part of this project. We are not putting any money in, neither are we going to support it in any way. David Hare took this information to Ram Mohan Roy. Ram Mohan Roy heard David Hare out, and then he said, look, the setting up of this such an educational institution that will impart Western learning, Western education to our young men is far more important than my being associated with it. So I withdraw from this project. I will not be part of this project, but please let this project go ahead. So Ram Mohan put his ego aside and allowed this project to go forward. But what this also shows is that the group that was supporting this project with money and a great deal of enthusiasm was a very orthodox group. And that orthodoxy is reflected in the name of the college, Hindu College, right? And the first clause of the rules and regulations of Hindu College makes this very clear. It says that the purpose of this college is to provide education to the sons of respectable Hindus. Respectable Hindus. And what kind of education? Education in English and the Indian languages and the literature and the sciences of Europe and Asia. So it was looking forward to providing a Western curriculum or Western education to the operative word that I want to emphasize for the purposes of my argument is respectable Hindus. So hence, the presence of Orthodox Hindus is reflected in the very first clause of the rules of Hindu College, okay? So as I said, it started functioning on January 20, 1817 in the beginning because it was a very small college in the private residences of certain individuals. And then finally it acquired its own campus or its own building in College Square, where the government provided a sum of rupees 1,24,000, and the land was given by David Hare in the north of College, what is called College Square. So the college moved there in January 1825 to its own premises, away from the private residences of some wealthy Calcuttans. 1825, next year, 1826, our principal character in the story, Dirozio, joined Hindu College as the fourth teacher. The designation given was he was a fourth teacher. He was only 17 years old when he got the job. So a little older, maybe a couple of years older than the students that he was actually teaching, okay? Now, it remains a bit of a mystery in the absence of available documentation of how Dirozio landed this job, okay? because Derozio had a before he was 17, he had a very strange and a somewhat of a unique career. He had been a precocious and a very prodigious student in a school that had been set up by David Drummond in central Calcutta. It was known as Drummond's Academy. He had made his mark there not only as a student, but as a poet as well. He studied there till he was 14. And at 14, he joined a company, a mercantile company, where his father was a chief accountant, James Scott and Company. But very soon, in the next 5 or 6 months, he left that company. Sorry, not 5 or 6, after 2 years. So when he was 16, he left Scott and Company to go and work in an indigo factory in Bhagalpur in Bihar. He returned from Bhagalpur to Calcutta in 1826. He became sub-editor of a journal called the India Gazette. And later that year, as I said, in 1826, he joined Hindu College as the 4th teacher at a salary of rupees 150 a month, which for a 17-year-old in 1826 was not a bad sum of money. He was not among the highest paid in the college, but it was, for a 17-year-old, as I said, a good sum of money to have. As this short sketch of Derozio's life before Hindu College makes very clear, that there is nothing in his curriculum vitae that quite explains why he got this job. He had no teaching experience, as we have seen. Also, Derozio was certainly not born into privilege, and therefore he was not a part of the elite of Calcutta. This is evident from two sets of facts. One, I've already told you, that is, if he had to seek employment at the age of 14, he was obviously not coming from a very well-to-do family. If he came from a well-to-do family, he wouldn't have to look for work at the age of 14, from the age of 14. That's one. Two, also the house where he lived, where he was born and where he lived, was outside the city of Calcutta. The city of Calcutta was demarcated by something that was known as the Maratha Ditch, which today has become the lower and the upper circular road of Calcutta. So the Maratha Ditch marked the boundary of Calcutta, and Derozio's house was on the eastern side of Lower Circular Road, or the Maratha Ditch. So it was described by a contemporary, a near contemporary, as the suburban side of Lower Circular Road, which shows that it is not considered the main part, or it was not considered to be the part of the main city of Calcutta. The elites of Calcutta lived in areas like Chaurangi, Park Street, and so on, but Derozio certainly did not live there. He lived outside the demarcated metropolitan area of the city of Calcutta. He was of Anglo-Portuguese descent, so he was of mixed parentage. His grandfather described himself when he was baptized. When his grandfather was baptized, he described himself as a native Protestant. The word native is important there. So he doesn't see himself as a foreigner. So the family, the Derozio family, was seen in Calcutta, like many other similar families, as being East Indians. Okay. And they were not considered to be part of the white population. The white population, in fact, looked down upon them, considered them to be somewhat inferior in the social hierarchy. So Derozio did not even have access to the wealthy and the privileged, to the elites who could have secured for him a job in Hindu college. So he neither had the curriculum vitae nor did he have the connections, as we would call it today, to get him this job. So it's a bit of a mystery. One possible answer to that mystery is that David Hare was known to be very sympathetic to underprivileged youth. And he often helped them with acts of generosity, charity, etc. And maybe David Hare, because he was connected to Hindu college, put in a word of recommendation about Derozio, and that's how Derozio got the job. Now, Derozio joins in 1826. He leaves in 1831. So his entire career in Hindu college spans about 5 years. Okay, a little short of 5 years, because he joins in November 1831 and he leaves joins in November 1826 and leaves in April 1831. So give or take a few months, 5 years. But within this 5 years, he became a legend in Hindu college. He became a legendary teacher. And many, and in that many I include myself, would consider him to be one of the most, if not the most outstanding teacher that Hindu college, which was later to become Presidency College, has ever had. Presidency College, as you know, is a very famous undergraduate teaching institution to which practically all famous Bengalis, except for Rabindranath Tagore, all famous Bengalis went. Satyajit Ray, Amartya Sen, just to take two examples. But there are many others, are not as famous as Satyajit Ray or Amartya Sen, who also went to Presidency College. So if you take the entire Hindu college, Presidency College span, Derozio is certainly one of the most outstanding, and I would actually put my neck out and say the most outstanding teacher of this institution. I also went to Presidency, by the way. So his teaching became the stuff of legend during his own lifetime. And ironically, it is this fame of his, or this success of his as a teacher, and his popularity as a teacher, that led to, or is connected to, his exit from the college itself. Now, before we come to the exit, what was it in Derozio's teaching that made him so popular, that made him the legendary teacher that he was in his own time? From the memoirs of certain of his students, it is possible to get some idea. It's not a complete idea, but to get some idea of how and what Derozio taught. Okay, both his manner of teaching and the content of his teaching. So these are the points that I have been able to gather. First, Derozio emphasized that students should think for themselves. They should not parrot the views of others. They should think for themselves. And he laid a great deal of importance on this. He said it was their sacred duty, I quote the two words, sacred duty, to think for themselves. So this is the primary duty, the primary responsibility of a student of Hindu college. They should think for themselves. Second, De Rosio said, there should be a free exchange of ideas among teachers and among students, and they should be free to express their own views and their opinions. They should speak out, in other words, what they were thinking, what they had doubts about, so on. Third, he encouraged students to read books which was not part of their syllabus or not part of the curriculum. And he often read aloud such books to them. So he was an active promoter of reading. He himself read aloud to them, encouraged students to read. Fourth, he impressed upon his students that their lives, even outside the college, should be imbued with truth and virtue. Education was not just something that was confined to the premises of the college. Education was also about how one approached life in general. And one, as an educated person, De Rosio said, students should approach life through truth and virtue. And finally, he said, students were free to meet him outside the college. So many outside the college, outside the classroom. So many students would actually go and see him in his home. So it became an exchange between teacher and student. And students often spoke frankly to them, frankly to him, and would tell them their problems, discuss their problems, etc., etc. Now, as you can guess, the facilitating factor behind this kind of teaching method, this kind of pedagogy, is age. He was in age, he was close to his students. As I said, 2 years, maybe 3 years older. So students could freely approach him. They felt at ease with him. They felt that he would understand the problems that they were articulating. But more importantly, what De Rosio was attempting to do was nothing more and nothing less than what good teachers invariably do. Encourage students to read, encourage students to think critically, and he was trying, in fact, to open up the minds of the students, right? He presented his hope and aim as a teacher in a sonnet, a poem that he wrote in 1829 when he was still teaching in Hindu college. Its opening lines are a poetic statement of his intention as a teacher, what his purpose, his vision for teaching. The opening lines are, expanding like the petals of young flowers, I watch the opening of your infant minds and the loosening of the spell that binds your intellectual energies and powers. So as I said, he was opening up the windows and doors of the minds. The impact that De Rosio's teaching had was not entirely unexpected or not entirely unsurprising. As students began to think for themselves and experience what De Rosio called, in the poem, he called it the loosening of the spell, they began to look critically at the world around them. Now, here we need to understand who were these students, what kind of family backgrounds did they come from. So an indication of the family backgrounds is already given in the first clause of the rules of Hindu college. These are boys from homes of respectable Hindus, if you remember. So these were boys, nearly all of them. without exception, from upper caste Hindu families. Their daily lives in their homes were enveloped in religious rituals and forms of deference associated with ritual. A historian has outlined this very succinctly. The historian concerned is Pradeep Sinha, who wrote a book on Calcutta's social history in the 19th century. And Pradeep Sinha wrote, "The family priest, the family deity, the large mass of traditionalists led by old opulent families and guided sometimes by uneducated Brahmins constituted a force whose impact on society was constantly felt, especially by the young students and graduates of the Hindu college." Now, influenced by their teacher, students from this kind of family background began to think for themselves and began to look critically at the lives that they lived in their homes. Okay? One consequence of this was they began to question religious ritual. Is all this necessary? How do they add to their life, add to our lives? Is it of any use? Okay. They began to question the pressures of orthodoxies. And some even went as far as to question even religious beliefs. Okay. At least raise the question about religious beliefs. There's a very funny anecdote connected to this. I can't stop myself from repeating this. There was a student of Desrosiers, a very favorite student of Desrosiers, who later became very famous in Calcutta as a public figure, as an orator. His name was Ram Gopal Ghosh. He came from this kind of background, which I've just sketched. And the family had a temple in their house, a temple devoted to the goddess Kali. And the standard practice was that whenever anybody left the home for work, for education, for whatever purposes, one went and paid respect to the goddess Kali, did pranam to the goddess Kali, and then went on to do the day's work. Ram Gopal Ghosh's father observed that for very few days, or very many days, Ram Gopal Ghosh was not carrying out this religious showing of devotion to the goddess Kali when he left for the college. So he called him and he said, "What is going on? I noticed that you do not do pranam to the goddess Kali. So why is this? What is the problem?" So Ram Gopal Ghosh did not answer. So, but that morning, when he left for the college, he stood in front of the temple, took his headgear. Those days, all respectable Indians and Bengalis wore a headgear. He took off his headgear and said, "Good morning, ma'am," and then left. So, he didn't do the traditional way of showing respect. So he was in fact defying orthodoxy. So anyway, that was one consequence of Desrosiers' teaching, questioning our surroundings, questioning societal practices, religious beliefs, orthodoxies, etc., etc. The second was, and this caused a stir. The second caused a bigger stir than the first. The second was, many of the students of Desrosiers came round to the view that all these prohibitions that we have on our lives, ritualistic prohibitions that we have on our life, are actually meaningless. And the first restriction they broke was the restrictions on diet. Many of them began to eat meat, including beef and pork and chicken. And some of them even took to drinking alcohol. all of which were considered taboo in Orthodox Hindu homes. So they started this. It's a form of, if you like, teenage or adolescent protest, defiance against the structures of authority, the structures of orthodoxy. And it was seen as that. It was seen as an adolescent insurrection. And it alarmed both the questioning of ritual and the breaking of dietary taboos was alarmed the Orthodox parents, who then spoke, because they were well connected, they spoke to the members of the managing committee of Hindu College. And they said, look, this is what's happening to our sons. They are coming to this college. We thought they were going to get educated. And instead, they are becoming rebels. They're defying, they're breaking taboos, they're defying authority, they're not listening to us. So something is wrong somewhere. And if you do not rectify the matter, I'm afraid, we are afraid we will withdraw our sons from the college. So this was something that the managing committee of Hindu College took rather seriously. This charge that students were being misled, they were being given odd ideas, etc. Was the first person to raise this alarm was a person called Radhakanta Deb, who came from one of the most illustrious families of Calcutta and who had been associated with Hindu College since the time it was first discussed. So not only the setting up, the inception of the college, he was involved in Hindu College from that time, and he was a diehard conservative. And he wrote a letter to the principal of Hindu College, a man called H.H. Wilson, who was later to become very famous as a professor of Sanskrit in the University of Oxford. And Radhakanta Deb wrote in this letter, "It has been reported to me from time to time and also published in the Bengali papers that the conduct of some of the adult students of the college is in the highest degree disorderly and irregular. And in various modes, this is important, in various modes inconsistent with the laws and usages of our caste, that in direct contradiction to its dictates, that is the dictates of the caste, they eat and drink prohibited articles with Mohammedans and Christians. So they are co-dining with non-Hindus." Radhakanta did not just stop there in criticizing the breaking of dietary taboos by the students. He also said many of the students were engaged in acts of fornication and sodomy. So he was also saying that sexually, the students of Hindu College or sections of the students of Hindu College were being depraved, quote unquote. So, and he went on to say that these students should be identified and these students should be expelled forthwith. They should be thrown out of the college. But what he added was more significant for our purposes. He said that teachers who are imbibing such ideas among the students should also be expelled or be sacked, fired from their jobs. And this practice that Hindus and non-Hindus should share food, should eat together at the same table during tiffin time, these should not be allowed in Hindu College. This was not the purpose of this had not been the purpose of setting up of Hindu college. What is noteworthy is that nowhere in the letter of Radhakanta Deb is Dirozio mentioned by name. That teachers are behind it is suggested, but no teacher is named, okay? But it hinted that Dirozio might actually be the culprit without naming. This was because, why I say it hinted, because the reference to Bengali papers, one Bengali paper, the Oriental Magazine, Bengali meaning published from Bengal, not in Bengali, had noted that in the house of Dirozio, students were meeting and they were drinking alcohol and they were eating pork and beef, okay? So Radhakanta Deb, by citing the Bengali papers, was indirectly pointing towards Dirozio as well. So the college authorities decided to set things in order. They stopped interdining. They had separate tables during tiffin time where the different castes sat and ate and so on and so forth. But they could not actually stop, or they did not. Wilson did not stop Dirozio from teaching. So Dirozio continued to teach as he had taught before, emphasizing critical thinking, encouraging reading, and so on and so forth. Now, the fig leaf of not naming Dirozio is removed. Now, parents write to the managing committee actually naming Dirozio as being the corrupter of their sons. And in a meeting of the managing committee, another very famous member of the Calcutta elite, Ram Kamal Sen, who is the grandfather of the Brahmo reformer Keshav Chandra Sen, said that the college would not prosper. In fact, the college would shut down. The college would not prosper till Dirozio was removed. Dirozio was described as being the root of all evil. So Dirozio is being identified. So the gloves were finally off, if you like, okay? So the Dirozio affair, if you like, what Dirozio was doing in Hindu college, whether he was the root of all evil or not root of all evil, was discussed in the managing committee meeting, and then finally it was put to the vote. Now, Wilson and Hare were both members of the managing committee. When it came to voting, no, sorry, before that, they argued that Dirozio, from all that they had heard, Dirozio was an exceptionally competent teacher. So one should not actually remove him because he is there to teach. And if he's successful as a teacher, he should not be removed. But when it came to the vote, both Wilson and Hare abstained. The reason for the abstention was that this was a matter that only affected the natives, okay? It only affected the Bengalis. So two Europeans should not get involved in this affair. Okay, let the natives decide what is good or what is bad for them. So the majority voted in favor of De Rosio's dismissal. 2 persons voted against his dismissal. 2 persons abstaining, 2 persons voting against his dismissal, but the majority was in favor of De Rosio's dismissal. When De Rosio came to know of this decision, he sent in his resignation on April 25, 1831. So now you see why I don't call it a resignation. If he hadn't put in that letter, he would have been dismissed. So I prefer to use the words sacking. In that resignation letter, actually, De Rosio sent 2 letters. One was his formal resignation letter, which I'm going to talk about just now. And he also wrote a personal letter to Wilson, which went separately, not part of the resignation letter. In the resignation letter, first let us take the resignation letter. He wrote to Wilson, I cannot conceal from myself the fact that my resignation is compulsory. So once again, justifying my use of the word sacking. My resignation is compulsory. And he went on to record the following facts. First, no charge, De Rosio wrote, first, no charge was brought against me. Second, if any accusation was brought forward, I was not informed of it. Thirdly, I was not called up to face my accusers if any such appeared. Fourthly, no witness was examined on either side. Fifthly, my conduct and character underwent scrutiny and no opportunity was afforded to me of defending either my conduct or my character. Sixthly, while a majority did not, as I have learned, consider me an unfit person to be connected with the college, it was resolved, notwithstanding, that I should be removed from it, so that, and these words are important, so that unbiased, unexamined, and unheard, you resolve to dismiss me without even the mockery of a trial. So De Rosio is saying, you did not even allow me a chance to speak and speak for myself, to defend myself. He thus left the portals of Hindu College. And by the next year, 1832, okay, so he's still a very young man. He's 22, 23 years old. He dies of cholera in utter penury. Utter penury of poverty. He died of cholera, dead in his early 20s. To come to the second letter, the private letter, that private letter was actually a reply, a response to something that Wilson had written to him. Wilson had written to him that the resignation was largely the work of the native members of the managing committee who had succumbed, Wilson said, to popular clamor. But what is important was that neither Hare nor Wilson ever spoke a word in favor of De Rosio after his dismissal. They were blaming the native members of the managing committee, but they did not put a foot forward to help him even when he was unemployed. They did not carry out anything in word or deed that would help Dirozio. They left him to die in poverty. Okay. So all this business that it was the native members of the managing committee who had done this, and I am not responsible as the principal, all this may have been a little bit of play acting on Wilson's part, okay, trying to absolve himself of the responsibility. So in response to that, Dirozio wrote another letter where he tried to explain what he had done as a teacher. Okay. This was done because Dirozio was asked very pointedly by Wilson in the letter that I have just stated, 3 questions. He was asked by Wilson, do you believe in God? 1. 2, do you think respect and obedience to parents to be a part of the moral duty of young men? 3, do you think the intermarriage of brothers and sisters is innocent and allowable? So is incest, in your words, permissible or not? And he further asked Dirozio, have you ever maintained these doctrines by argument in the hearing of our students? Now, Dirozio took up these questions point by point. This is the private letter that I was talking about. It's in response to what Wilson has written to him, the questions that Wilson has asked him. So these questions also, this is important to bear in mind, these questions also give us an indication of the kind of charges that had been brought against Dirozio in the managing committee. Obviously, he had been charged with atheism, supporter of incest, somebody who didn't teach respect for elders and so on. So Dirozio in his letter, in his reply, said that he had never denied the existence of God in the hearing of any human being. Okay? He had never denied the existence of God in the hearing of any human being. What he had done as a teacher, Dirozio said, was to introduce the students to both sides of the argument. He had explained to them the arguments for theism, for belief in God, and he had explained to them the arguments for atheism, for non-belief in God. And he had said he had recommended readings on both sides of the fence, belief and non-belief. So he said, I had just asked students to think. So if I am being charged by the fact that I encourage students to be atheistic, I should also be complimented by the fact that I gave students readings that encouraged them to be theists. You cannot, I gave them readings of both kinds, so you cannot say one is more important than the other. I gave them the pros and cons of the argument. He asserted that he was being held responsible for the atheism of some students, but he should also be held responsible for the theism of others. Before we move to the answers to the 2 other questions, it is worth pausing a little bit to look at the way Dirozio phrased his answer to the question, do you believe in God? What did he say? He said, in the hearing of a human being, any human being, in the hearing of any human being, he had never denied the existence of God. Now, this statement, does it tell you, did he believe in God or did not? He did not believe in God. All that he is saying is that I never articulated I did not articulate my disbelief in God, if he was disbelieving of God, in the presence of other human beings. So he might have kept his atheism. It is entirely possible that he kept his atheism privately within himself. So he is not actually answering the question whether he's an atheist or not. He's not saying I'm an atheist. He's not saying he's a theist. He's saying publicly, I have never said I'm an atheist. So Derozio is being a little bit disingenuous, if you like. He is not being very clear about his beliefs. He's being a little clever, if I may put it like this. So on the other two questions, he said, these are absurd. I have never promoted incest, never argued in favor of incest, never encouraged incest. And if you talk to my students, you will find out that I've always emphasized to them the importance of respecting their elders, their parents, and so on and so forth. In fact, he said, in 2 cases where 2 of my students had fought with their fathers, I sent them back home and I said, your first duty is to apologize to your father. And then you can come back to me and continue to be my students. If you don't apologize, you are no longer my student. So he said, you can check that. And he named the 2 students as well. So these were the 3 answers to the questions that, 3 questions that pointedly Wilson had posed to Derozio. Now, what from the bits and pieces about Derozio that I have presented to you, what kind of a person does he appear to be? What were, not kind of person, what were his beliefs? What were his core beliefs? And this is also supported by the kind of poetry that he wrote, the influences on his poetry and so on and so forth, about which I'm not going into at this point of time. So Derozio fashioned himself as a creature of the Enlightenment. He sought inspiration from Kant, whose work he translated, from Francis Bacon, from Voltaire, and so on and so forth. His inspiration for his poetry was Shelley and Keats, the Romantic poets. Okay. He taught his students to read David Hume, the father of skepticism and one of the pioneers of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment intellectual lineage in Derozio is very, very evident and clear. And he believed that as a teacher, his duty as a teacher was to convey these ideas, the importance of reason, the importance of doubt, the importance of critical thinking. In that letter to Wilson, that private letter to Wilson, Derozio wrote, and I quote again from this letter, and this will be my last quotation, entrusted as I was for some time with the education of youth peculiarly circumstanced, was it for me to have made them pert and ignorant dogmatists, setting aside the narrowness of mind which such a course might have evinced? It would have been injurious to the mental energies and acquirements of the young men themselves. Okay, so Derozio in that sentence is acknowledging 2 things. One is that very telling phrase, peculiarly circumstanced. So he knew exactly from what kind of family background the boys were coming from. Okay. And he euphemized it by saying peculiarly circumstanced. But he believed that as a teacher, he could not let them remain in the rut of those circumstances. That would make them dogmatists. He wanted to remove the shackles of dogmatism and the narrowness of the mind. Okay, so he took up the method of teaching that he did take up, which we have already described. The problem was, and this is at the root at the removal of De Rosio, the problem was that those fathers who had sent their sons to Hindu college were not concerned with the opening up of the minds of their sons. They wanted their sons to learn English, have a rudimentary understanding of Western education so that they would get government jobs. De Rosio did not see education in such transactional terms. He believed education, going back to the root of the word educare, which is to go beyond. The Latin word means to go beyond. De Rosio believed that education is about opening up of the minds. And when he opened or tried to open up the minds of the students reacted in different ways. And one way that they reacted was by questioning orthodoxy, by questioning religious beliefs and rituals, and by questioning authority. This, neither the fathers nor the authorities of Hindu college could quite accept. They had not quite bargained for this. That education could lead to this, they had not bargained for. So the bigger conclusion that I want to draw and end with is that Hindu college is considered to be the fountainhead of modern liberal education in India. This is from where it all started. But Hindu college was actually mired in orthodoxy. Therefore, it could have no accommodation for a teacher like De Rosio who wanted to open up the minds of his students. So, education for employment and education for opening up the minds. These were the two issues that were at conflict. And may I add, they remain in conflict even today in our education system. Thank you. I've gone on for too long.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very enlightening and very interesting lecture. And I think the ideas that you talked about are truly are true for today as well in almost all the top institutions in India and in the world. Professor T.K.V. Subramanian says this episode also stands testimony to the fact that there was rationalization of thought, but not secularization of culture in the European perception of modernity. So with this, we would like to thank Professor Mukherjee for taking out time from his busy schedule and for delivering the 11th Car1 Distinguished Lecture, which is also the last session of this year, 2020. 2020 was a very tough year for many of us. We were restricted to our screens for interactions. We had more than 100 sessions in 2020 where we invited almost 80 scholars from around the world to interact with students and researchers. So We look forward to having you all again in 2021 with a new zeal and with the hope that the situation will be better and we can all meet in Delhi very soon. Thank you very much, sir, and thank you very much, everybody who joined us live. Have a great evening.
Thank you.